what interested me in thinking about anthropology and the Portuguese archive was that this new wave of professional anthropology, which emerged in the 1960s, this French and Anglo-American researchers, was a kind of new approach to anthropology. And Rui Senati was very much, as David has explained in his article in 2011 on ethnographic research in Portuguese Timor, Rui Senati was a very important facilitator and sponsor of that work, particularly with Louis Bert, who encouraged people to come and do this anthropology. And so we have these, I could think of them myself as these famous names, of which three of them are here today, and I'm very pleased to see them. And they can correct me on my misapprehensions of things. But these people, Louis Bert, Claudine Freeberg, Brigitte Renard Clermont-Giron, David Higgs, Elizabeth Traub, and so on, were, as David has explained, undertook intensive long-term anthropology, ethnography within East Timor, Portuguese Timor, and as David said, greatly expanded our ethnographic knowledge and they opened up Timor in many ways to international scholarship. What was striking to me when I looked at the works that they've done, but there's almost no absence of Portuguese references in their works, and I just give you some examples of that. The one I thought of was Jim Fox's edited, really a classic kind of book these days, The Flow of Life, in 1980, included 5 papers on Portuguese Timor from many of the researchers I mentioned. None of them have references to any Portuguese text. Bessie's work, Cosmology and Social Life, Ritual Exchange among the Mambai, also does not mention Portuguese references. And David's work, Tetum, Ghost and Kin, another classic from that period, mentions one, Arte de Sa, Textos em Teto da Literatura Oral Timorense. So what occurred to me is I'm asking the question, why was the long period of Portuguese colonialism in the area apparently of no importance to understanding the contemporary social formations that people were looking at? We've heard already there was a significant amount of material. Now, I had this conversation with David about this, and I'm going to use some of our email correspondence in a moment. But there are 3 basic reasons, it seems, that come out to explain that. And the first is the nature of the questions being asked of the ethnography at the time. The second was the comparative relevance of the colonial material that they had to work with. And the third was an unfamiliarity with Portuguese writings. I think the third, I'm going to discount the third in some respects, because some of these people who I'm talking about were familiar with it, I think. I mean, some had come out of a Brazilian anthropological experience. So I think there was a sense in which the Portuguese writing was known. But in particular, the first 2 issues, and it struck me that the people who were doing the kind of ethnography of that period were very much interested in the fashionable theories of anthropology, alliance theory. The whole area of East Timor, and indeed Eastern Indonesia, was a very attractive area for people who wanted to understand kinship systems, kinship and alliance systems, because of the agnatic and the cross-cousin marriage systems that were very much an example of. It attracted the Dutch structural school of anthropologists, for example. It attracted Levi-Strauss and his structuralism. And in a sense, people were looking at these societies in their own terms, looking at the internal dynamics and the category relationships. They weren't so much interested in the sort of that colonial context in which they worked. At the same time, there was an absence of a good source material in the Portuguese anthropology writings for comparative assessment. And here's the quotes I got from David when I was talking to him. And he made, I think, a very interesting point, that there was a substantial amount of ethnographic work had already been carried out in Timor Portuguese, but with the exception of Antonio de Almeida, who we've just heard about, none had been conducted by professional ethnographers, and even they had not employed local languages to obtain their facts, nor with the exception of Almeida y Carmo, who wrote this work on the Mambai, and Francisco Azevedo Gomes, who talks about the Fatalugu, had anyone studied any single community intensively. So I think that's the first point, that he was aware, and I think everyone then was aware of the limitations, let's say, of the Portuguese archive. And David also said, my Tetum, Ghost and Kin book does not include any of the Portuguese sources on the Tetum from the Viqueque sub-district, only because he didn't have any sources. And although mine is a structural approach, had there been such info, I would have used it if it was relevant to what I was writing. So I guess there's a kind of short answer. But to the question about why there's no references. But just as a kind of summary, what my experience too of the looking at working through some of the archives is that you have these conclusions I might draw. And one is that the Portuguese studies of colonial subjects give little attention to Timorese perspectives per se, and we've heard a bit about that already. Studies viewed through the colonial lens of traditions of the usos y costumes, interpreted through the stylings of translators for the most part. There's a general absence of Timorese voices in the colonial archive, although Gonçalves mentioned that interesting set of comments from Martinho, so there's obviously some people are sort of projecting that or representing that. And this French and American anthropologists were exploring forms of ethnographic knowledge for which there was no equivalent in the Portuguese archive. And just want to add to that there's also some acknowledgement of that within the Portuguese sort of context as well. Captain Boxer, the sort of famous historian of Portuguese, talks about the conquistador and clerical mentality in the sense that they were more interested in action and doing things rather than writing. Recenati sort of mirrors that by saying the Portuguese had been known to be more ready for action than for writing. And Geoffrey Gunn also makes a good point, I think. It's certainly not the case that Timor has been neglected in the Portuguese letters, but just that few of the massive histories and compilations of documents went beyond a Portugalising perspective. I think that's a very interesting observation. It was all about them, right? It's all about the Portuguese. It really wasn't about the povo or the indigena or whatever. So there was, however, one exception, and I wanted to just mention this too, which was Joachim Metzner's geoecological study of 1977, Man, Land and Environment in East Timor, where he did fieldwork prior to 75, 69, 70, and he really used an extensive amount of archival records: history, agriculture, forestry, development, governance planning, geography and languages. And I must say that Joachim Metzner is not an anthropologist. Well, at least I don't think of him in that way. He was talking more about development planning or how the area might be developed further in agriculture and so on. But it seems to me his publication is an exception to this English language anthropology at the time. And I'm suggesting here that the exceptionalism, however, demonstrates the point, that you weren't using Portuguese material. Okay, so now let me just move, just briefly, I want to make some comments about this post sort of occupation ethnography that people are engaged in now, as well as history. There is this fantastic new and sustained interest in the ethnography of Timor-Leste by both national and international searchers. And the interests are very much directed, as I suggested, as much on the past as they are on the present. So it's a kind of understanding the present situation in terms of what's happened before. That's very much a topical kind of issue for people. So there's this much greater interest in the collective colonial archive. And I very much enjoyed reading Ricardo's book, Headhunting and Colonialism. I think it's a fantastic example of exactly this trend, really, which highlights the possibilities for, in his case, for an ethnographically informed post-colonial historical critique, I think in ways that are very revealing indeed of the nature of the material and very, very revealing of the use of colonial archive in very kind of creative ways. My own work in looking at some of this stuff meant that, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work in Lautém with the Fataluku people, as you may know, and that it eventually became clear to me that the ethnographic research I was doing led me to a desire to understand more about the historical context in which I was working. So things come up, mythologies, references to different things, and I felt that I needed to have more of some kind of historical framing for this loose sort of the loose temporality of the way people talk about things. So I've started, basically since 2004 or 5 or so, I've tried to sort of build my understanding of what materials are available in the archive, and I've looked whether it's in customary land tenures or these mythologies of settlement or histories, Lulic traditions, customary governance and so on. It's useful, I think, to use archives to illuminate and locate some of the material I'm thinking about and working on. What I found, I suppose, what's clear to me though, is that Lautém is particularly sparse in terms of early modern histories. I've looked at a lot of archival material to find out stuff. Pre-1900, there's really not a lot of references. And what I find, in fact, that I get more out of the non-Portuguese writing in terms of references to Lautém than I do on the Portuguese. Partly, I suppose, that's the limitations of my own capacity to pour through archives in Portuguese. That's something that I'm still working on. But I suspect that, given what I've mentioned before, that the problem for Lautém was that it lay outside areas of control for such a long time. And when you do find people talking about it, say in the late 19th century, it's always about complaints of the contrabandistas and all these corcoras turning up and illegal trading and macassaries everywhere and so on. And so I think there was a sense in which the Portuguese were only really stamped their authority really quite late in the piece there. Now, I just want to make a few final comments. Recently, with my colleague Chris Shepherd, I've been working on the history and political ecology of plantations and plantation development in East Timor, which is a fascinating area, and really beginning with the origins of coffee plantations under Afonso de Castro, and continuing to right up to the present day in different kind of permutations of plantation. And what we're thinking about it in terms of a way of understanding the relationship between the colonial power and the subjects and the subjugation of the population as well. So this notion that they were cultivating plantations but also cultivating subjects through the process. And so through a kind of analysis of what I'll call a genealogy of plantations, you can look at the shifting power relations enacted through these plantation economies as long-term sites for the making of colonial and post-colonial social relations. And in doing that, we've drawn extensively on the archive, and it's proved to be quite revealing, I might say. And once again, a lot of the discussion that we find of use occurs post-1900 in many ways. It seems to be after 1900 people were writing a lot more about what was going on. Before that, they weren't much, or it's rather fragmentary and, as I say, they're rather economical with their descriptions of what was happening. And just a few final points, that it seems to us, our conclusion is that the plantation archive is an exemplar of the colonial gaze that subsumes Timorese agency and voice in favour of the prerogatives and aspirations of the civilising mission of colonialism. So in a sense, a kind of mirroring what Ricardo's talked about in terms of the wars of pacification, the kind of the justifications for plantations have a sort of similar ring to it. So you find within it these racialist discourses and the redemptive moral benefits of labour on the plantations, the violence of the shifting regimes of power within that, and the reproduction of these class distinctions, which always favoured the mestizo elites, the Leorais and so on, against the povo, against whether they were slaves, classed as slaves, whether they were criminals and so on, who end up so much of the forced labour on the plantations. So what I'm suggesting there, for me in this case, looking at plantation histories, in a sense through the archives in this case. There's value in reading against the grain and trying to map historical records against indigenous cultural memories and received knowledge about the past. And what strikes me, having kind of worked through some of this stuff with Chris on the archival material, what we really need to do is spend more time looking at speaking ethnographically with people who were participating in a lot of these. We haven't done that extra step. So once again, I think, as we've talked already in a number of sessions, we need to marry these two propositions. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you. I'm finished.
And now we hand the word to Rui Graça Feijó from the University of Coimbra and Susana de Matos Viegas here from the Instituto de Ciências Sociais of the University of Lisbon, who will present a paper, Entanglements, Buffalo Heads and Tombs in Lautém.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting us to be here. This is so far the only paper which is of joint authorship, and in this instance, Susana, as you know, is a trained anthropologist. I was trained as an historian. So we are trying to see if our romantic relationship can be transported into this academic endeavor. And the approach we are taking here, as Andrews just said, is not so much what we have been hearing most of today about people who take their anthropological concepts and theories into the archives. We are rather trying to tell you what we have been able to learn by bringing the archives with us into fieldwork and contacting people in a research which is on contemporary society. We start our presentation by showing you a photo published by Rui Sinat in one of his volumes about Timor. Here we can see, to start with, two things. First, we have an image of a traditional Fataluco house in Lautém. This is only one of many similar images that can abundantly be found in Sinati's work, revealing the interest he devoted to material culture and to housing and architecture in particular, and were influential in designing the research of Maria Olímpia Lameiras Campagnolo in the 1960s on Fataluco houses. The photo also illustrates, however, another element that has received far less attention and deserves that we choose it for our comments: Fataluco tombs. Sinati's photographic archive, which is now located in the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon, has many different photos of tombs, mostly of stone tombs, but his published work only refers to them in a rather anachronistic way as being representations of so-called megalithic culture. We will address here three aspects concerning tombs and which are present in this photo. First, the funerary posts exhibiting a large buffalo skull with its big horns. This is locally named Arapo Chau, Arapo from buffalo and Chau for head in Fataluco. Second, the stone on top of the tomb, which is called locally Nahotu, meaning reclining. And third, something which is of a very significant importance, and that is very obvious and becomes very obvious only becomes very obvious when we are on the ground. The grave is located next to the house. There is a close vicinity between the house and the grave. This presentation results from our ongoing research on Fataluco territory, which was only started last year, where cemeteries, burial of relatives and fallen heroes designated locally as mártires da pátria, and funerary posts of buffalo horns occupy a special role. Although there are some ancient cemeteries that are now far from hamlets and villages and remain the object of ceremonial reverence, whose importance for the Fataluco life has been very extensively treated by Andrew MacWilliam, the norm for present-day cemeteries is that they are either close to a village or literally dispersed among its houses. I call your attention to this particular photo in which modern house and modern buffalo heads coexist with satellite dishes, so ways of communicating, different technologies of communication here present. In Lautém, cemeteries are mostly family-based cemeteries and people frequent them on a daily basis. Children play around the tombs, escalate them for joy, and neither they nor adults question the presence of Malays taking photos of their relatives' tombs. The process through which a deceased starts being transformed into an ancestor among Fataluco is a crucial process in which, in our view, the funerary posts and the stone on top of the tomb play roles. These will be the focus of the first section, while the second and last one will address more closely the proximity between houses and tombs, mostly referring to the burial of fallen heroes. In February of this year, a local Catuas had passed away, and his family was busy building a tomb in line with what was to be expected from social status of the deceased when we passed through. As is the rule for funerary ceremonies in Timor, this one included a great number of the extended kin network, some of them having traveled from distant places. Among those, we met Cipriano, a son of the deceased, who had traveled with his sister and brother-in-law all the way from the UK, where they live. Conversations with Cipriano and his kin became a fundamental element to illuminate our understanding of funerary practices and their material symbols. One of those elements is that the height of the tomb is a fundamental point to consider. In this case, an older brother of the deceased who had passed away a few years before and had been succeeded by him in the prestigious social position he had occupied set the measure to which the new tomb had to respond. You can see the tomb on the foreground is just a few centimeters smaller than the one in the background that existed for several years. Days after we participated in the Chipi Chipi Lemezu ceremony, the so-called bitter flowers ceremony, mixing Catholic and local traditions in the region, that occurs 1 week after the burial. Relatives are still together, animals are sacrificed, and relatives attending the funeral go back to the cemetery to spread flowers on top of tombs. The most distinguished persons present in ceremony are the first to spread the bouquets. Wife givers, Aropata, are included in this group, but also, for instance, the chef de suco, and of course, Malays like us that we were invited to participate. The tomb is closed, the funerary post is thus erected, and the stone is concomitantly put on top of the tomb. So here is an image of the final aspect of the tomb we saw being constructed from the start. Days passed, and the closest kin came to pay a visit to the tomb and stay chatting or just feeling their grief. During that period, we accompanied Cipriano in a visit to his father's tomb. When we arrived, his mother and sister were already chatting by the side of the tomb embellished with candles. He then stepped on the tomb and lit a cigarette, which he subsequently put in the little hole in the stone, commenting with us that he was sharing a cigarette with his father. As we mentioned in the beginning, Naoto in Fataluku means to recline, and people actually refer that it allows for the deceased to recline and rest, and to those who come to meet him to establish a communication with him, which a fact that is also mentioned by Francisco de Araújo Gomes in his short monograph related to the 1960s. This communication through the stone and the funerary posts is thus part of the process through which a deceased starts a long process of identification as an ancestor. The shape of the funerary post is also meaningful, invoking connections between the dead and their status as ancestors. Thus, the shape of the funerary post, with its height and different levels of skulls, is said to evoke that of stairs that enable the deceased to make his journey to meet his other relatives. A short note should be made to the fact that tombs do have sometimes the shape of stairs. This is a tomb near Tutuala, which also reveals this idea, although this one doesn't have the buffalo heads, the idea of stairs for the deceased to make their way to the other world. The status of the deceased is simultaneously displayed and constituted both through the naoto and through the size and quality of the buffalo skulls. In the latter case, also very significantly through the size of the buffaloes and their horns. Nowadays, in Lautém, a calf can be purchased for $300 or $400, whereas an adult animal can sell for $800, but a truly old one for as much as $1,500. This is the price Cipriano and his siblings actually paid for the animal they bought near Tutuala. Different people described to us this fact, always mentioning that he had bought a buffalo with huge horns, rather than mentioning any other facts like being old, being big, having a lot of meat. No. The thing was, it costed $1,500, it had large horns. The prominence of one particular pair of horns in the funerary post is very frequent indeed, as was the case for Cipriano's father's funeral. So you see that it is a rather big animal indeed. The significance of the size of the horns has been noticed already, by instance, by Andrew, as a sign of, I quote, the completion of funeral obligations and the animal slaughtered as a mark of respect and esteem for the deceased. Among references to buffalo horns as a sign of extreme abundance and prestige in East Timor literature, one that is worth noting is a narrative analyzed by David Hicks, almost certainly Tetum or Kemak, in his article on fishing hook symbols, in which one particular buffalo, big and with huge horns, establishes the finishing episode about fortune and abundance. Further research must follow these lines, but A very suggestive idea that can be already established with some degree of confidence is that buffalo horns have a say about powerfulness of ancestors and beyond. One of the most striking features of modern-day Fataluk funerary posts is their coexistence with other powerful symbols in the graves. Besides the tension and ambivalences to the time of the Portuguese and the time of Indonesians, it is well known that the influence of the Roman Catholic Church has markedly increased over the quarter century of Indonesian domination. In many cases, the strength of the ancestral practices has been accommodated without difficulty in parallel with modern ones and Catholic ones. Just to tell you that my first impression was that someone had just put this cap and left casually. But we visited the site 9 months later, and it was there. So it was not so casual, because 9 months later it remained in place. It might look casual, but not really so much. Funerary practice fall under the number of those that evolved from clash to accommodation, even if sometimes Catholic officers expressed their uneasiness regarding the final compromise, further exposed by the double presence of the funerary post and the Christian cross in this particular grave, in line with what is frequently found all around the region. So this is a very common sight, the buffalo heads being put against a Christian cross. Combination of symbols pertaining to different aspects of the deceased's own life are not limited to funerary posts and Christian crosses. The engagement of the deceased in the fight for independence, which will be developed further down, is only one example that may add a third layer of symbols to the graves. Here you see the Fretilin flag being painted on the grave itself, the cross in the plaque, and the buffalo head standing above. The point, as David mentioned this morning when referring to this same photo, is that this is possible after independence. This would be unthinkable in 1975. In 1975, we would have Fretilin fighting the church fighting Fretilin, the church fighting the buffalo heads, Fretilin fighting the buffalo heads. Everybody would be fighting each other and not accommodated in this, the way we can see it here. The terms of absolute incompatibility between those terms seems to have given place to a world in which each one has redefined its meaning and reconfigured its relation to the other elements, replacing the old idea of elimination of the other by that of cohabitation with the other. Cohabitation is actually the title of our research project, and this is a concept that we very much want to discuss in our work. Okay, it's just 2 pages. The issue of grave sites and their importance for local populations can be found in historical records of colonial Timor. Fernando Figueiredo's historical account of the Portuguese presence in the island quotes 2 important colonial administrators on this issue. Teófilo Duarte, who was governor in 1927-28, and Armando Pinto Correia, who was there from 28 to 34, who wrote, in the words of Sabina Fonseca, as a nationalist military fulfilling the role of an anthropologist, for which he was actually praised by Van Gennep. Duarte, in the wake of former Governor Celestino da Silva, of which we've heard earlier, was an enthusiast of a policy of forced resettlements. On the contrary, Pinto Correia sustained that the colonial administrators should abstain as much as possible from interfering with the most profound and intimate aspects of indigenous lives. In this light, I have disagreed from the determinations imposed by several of my colleagues that forced Timorese to concentrate in new settlements. So what Indonesians have done in their time had already been attempted much before by the Portuguese colonial administrators after the end of the 19th century. The end result, however, of these efforts was resounding failure. Nevertheless, the views of both men, Duarte and Pinto Correia, coincide in what regards the cause that explains the failure of those attempts. For Teófilo Duarte, material benefits, I quote, will not suffice to make them accept in good manner those resolutions, given that they imply a separation of the population from the graves of their ancestors, normally located in the vicinity of their current houses. The intensity of this sentiment was such that, in spite of, I quote, a spirit of obedience that characterizes these people and the goodwill of their chiefs, end quote, he labeled the program of resettlement as a dangerous operation. As for Pinto Correia, these policies of colonial governance achieved no result because they met the passive but strenuous opposition of the indigenous peoples chained to their plots of land and seeking in the proximity of their ancestors' graves the same moral solace the Europeans find in their family shrines. The critical element is thus identified by both these authors as the value of vicinity between the dwellings of the living and resting places of ancestors. The issue raised by these colonial administrations emerges today in a new configuration that we can address by focusing on issues related to fallen heroes of the resistance period. Probably the major initiative to pay homage to the fallen heroes was the construction in Metinaro of the National Cemetery named Garden of Heroes. The stated purpose was to bury in this cemetery the most prominent figures of the country, as is normal in any pantheon. However, the National Cemetery poses some problems. I think this is... I'll just go through the next couple of pictures so that we can quickly come to an end. So this is Metinaro Cemetery. For those of you who have seen Santa Cruz Cemetery, there can be no greater contrast. Orthogonal, neat, organized, with different plots reserved for graves which are exactly alike. Can you show the next? You see, all graves look alike. In Santa Cruz, you have the opposite. Each grave is different from the next one. Architecture, color, decoration, everything is actually different in Santa Cruz. So there are resistances to this idea. This is an ideological plan, and there are resistance to these. Can you show the next one, please? They have decided to make Garden of Heroes in each district, basically around a house which is an ossuary, painted in strange colors, and which tend to be completely empty because people don't understand and don't see the meaning of the ossuary. This is what was being built in just outside Los Pavos as the Garden of Heroes for the district. For those who, not being of very high ranking in the resistance, would be still important enough to be buried there. Still, we believe that there is resistance to this idea. Can you show the next? So there are three things which happened in practice. One is that people, instead of bringing their death to the Garden of Heroes, go to the graves they had and embellish them. This was not possible before 1999, of course, to have Fretilin flag, the national flag, guns and so forth, but this is possible, and therefore they got money either specifically for the purpose, or most of the times they used what was being given as veterans' pensions and they spent huge amounts of money in embellishing these graves. The second, The second is where there are mass graves which make it difficult for identification of individuals. This is the monument being erected where there are supposed to be 4 or 5 people, one of them being the deceased husband of someone who is now an MP for CNRT in Dili. A person who has been very active throughout resistance period. And next to these, there are similar, smaller size, but anyway, for nine corpses, they have built 3 very huge structures. The last one is people go, collect from Matebian remains, from Matebian or from where they know the remains were, and relocate them. They relocate them just outside their houses. They relocate them very close to where they live, and they make very huge and very expensive cemeteries. In this case, it was a family who was able to retrieve 18 corpses from relatives, and they are all just outside their survivors' living places. The final thing is money is also being devoted to building monuments like this one in Pitileti, in the site of a massacre. There was a massacre there, and although there are no bones, no cemetery, they have erected these. So the conclusion that we take from this is that, of course, there is a national tendency to honor the dead. It's something that Xanana has, in a way, helped and instigated. But the national approach, which separates the final resting place of the dead from where they lived or where they fell, is met with utter skepticism, and alternative ways are being pursued. We got these, again, from the photo of Rui Sinati and from the 2 colonial administrators. That is how we think that archives brought to the field work have helped us to elucidate what lies behind these trends. Thank you.